Hello, I'm John Coleman, and the name of this presentation is There Is No Significant Global Warming. And I'm the guy that is just doggone sure of that. Now, you may think that I'm just a paid-off shill, big oil, or something of that sort. No. They've never given me a nickel. I'm a television weathercaster with 60 years experience, a meteorologist. I was the first weatherman on Good Morning America. I'm the man who founded the Weather Channel, and this is my accomplishment. Broadcast Meteorologist of the Year from the American Meteorological Society, of which I was a professional member for many years. I finally quit the AMS when it became very clear to me that the politics had gotten in the way of the science, and it was time to talk about something else. You can go back into the 70s and come up to today, and there's almost no warming. I mean, less than 1 degree warming since 1978. And absolutely no warming since 1998. What kind of deal is that? Well, I'll tell you what kind of deal it is. It's the kind of deal that's full of silliness if you're promoting climate change and global warming. We are in one of the most stable and beautiful periods of Earth's climate you could hope for. And look at the stark contrast between the spaghetti of the many models of atmospheric warming created by various people who have gotten tens of millions of dollars of federal grant money and worked for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and there's the average of all their models. And then here's the real temperatures as measured both on Earth and with our satellites. And folks, it's just not happening. So let me just give you the hard, cold facts. I showed you this when I tweeted it. There isn't any warming going on. There hasn't been. Nothing significant is happening. Oh, we have extreme natural variations in temperature. That's a hard, cold fact. But this recent warming, it's no different than the warming that has occurred many times before naturally. We had a medieval optimum when the Roman Empire flourished, and we had the little ice age when times were very tough. This little warming we have now, gosh, that's no big deal. That's just no big deal. Now, you want to talk about big deals. This is a hard, cold fact. From the ice cores, we have determined that we have vacillated on Earth between extreme ice ages and these beautiful interglacial periods of warming weather. And we live in the most recent of these interglacial periods. We've been in it for 12,000 years. Probably have another 10, 12,000 years to go before the next ice age comes on, naturally. And can we cope with that? So I've plotted all these hard, cold facts and presented them to you. And then I compare them to what you read in the press, what you hear on the air, what the networks tout. And you say, man, what a difference between reality and what's there. Does Coleman know his reality? You bet I do, folks. I study it every day. But how did this strange, bad science, how did this global warming, climate change, this crisis, how did it get started? Well, that's the story I'm going to tell you today. And that story begins with this great scientist, a man named Roger Revelle, who was a graduate of the University of California, Berkeley, in oceanography, who then served in the Navy during World War II, then became the director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and who led research on the environmental impact of the atomic test on those atolls out in the Pacific following World War II, both atmospheric and ocean impact. And as that was coming to an end, he had greatly grown the Scripps Oceanographic Institution from an isolated small organization to a huge professional organization with many ships and hundreds of employees. It became clear he had to have something new to work on. And that's when he decided that something had to give. So he hired this man, Hans Suess, a professor from the University of Chicago who had done studies on the effect of carbon in the atmosphere. And Revelle thought maybe there was something to that. So he and Suess did a research paper, and they put it out, in which they asked the question, is mankind's burning of fossil fuels to the coal in our stokers that were heating our homes, the oil in our cars, the fuel, old-fashioned gasoline in old-fashioned cars, was all of that creating a climate issue? Well, that was the beginning. That paper that Seuss and Revell put out is actually the paper that started the global warming frenzy. Oh man, did they start something. And Revell then, he became a powerful man as a basis of that. His science was used all over the world by other scientists. And he started campaigning to establish a campus of the University of California co-located with his Scripps Oceanographic Institution at La Jolla, California. That was a big darn deal. Well, guess what happened? It was located there, but something happened. Revell suffered the greatest defeat of his life. He had campaigned to get that university there and thought he would be its first chancellor, but the politics backfired on him, and he wasn't named chancellor of that university, and he was hurt. So what did he do? He suddenly made a big move. He changed his life. He packed up and went to Harvard, where he started the Center for Population Studies. So there he was in Boston in 1967. Now, what does this have to do with the global warming story? This is what it has to do with it. That first year, one of his students was this young man, Al Gore. The only science class Al Gore ever took. Revell didn't remember having him in class. But Al Gore, who got a D in the course, was highly impressed. He was the son of a politician out of Tennessee, and he used what he learned there to start his global warming campaign. He wrote a book called Earth in the Balance. He ran for the U.S. Senate. He claimed that the Earth was being challenged by our burning of fossil fuels, and it got him elected to the U.S. Senate. And there in the Senate, he conducted hearings, bringing in scientists and spreading the scare of global warming. And that's when the money began to flow from the government to research. And this was the booby trap. Because once billions of dollars of government funding was going out to these organizations at universities and research groups across the nation, and they had to back that global warming claim that Al Gore was promoting with their research, the research began to pile up. And if you were a young scientist, you didn't have a choice. You couldn't put out a research paper that said, oh, what warming? You'd be out of a job. You'd lose your job, your car, your family. You'd be walking on the streets. No, you had to support it. Al Gore had taken Revell and Seuss's research paper and used it to start the global warming campaign. And what did Al Gore say? He said, this is Roger Revell. He was my mentor. He's my hero. He's the man who spread the alarm. Well, there was another man that picked that up, this man, Maurice Strong. Maurice had become a bureaucrat at the United Nations, and in 1972 he had a conference in Stockholm on the environment, and his whole goal was one world government. And he used the impetus of that global warming scare at that Stockholm conference to start the initiative that set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So now we had the U.S. government and the United Nations both promoting climate change, and it all came from that Revell Seuss paper and the research that followed and the dollars that were now flowing, and man, it was underway big time. So the IPCC, it had scientists and bureaucrats and politicians from throughout the world. It had the World Wildlife Federation, the Sierra Club, all the environmentalists, and they all got together and they voted that global warming was for real. Well, I got to tell you something. You don't settle science by a vote. It's not a political issue. It's not a vote. It's science. But never mind. They put out their reports, and they spent a lot of time telling us how we were destroying planet Earth. And they had fancy meetings in tropical locations throughout the world. And the scientists who supported global warming got the paid vacation trips to these big meetings and got to write these books and have their names and their careers. And man, it was a big deal. And what did Al Gore do? Well, he wrote a second book about global warming called An Inconvenient Truth. And we all know what became of that. His liberal friends in Hollywood turned that into a documentary, a sci-fi documentary, I might add, all about global warming. And they voted themselves an Oscar, Best Documentary Film of the Year in 2007. And then they turned around, and Al Gore stood by the IPCC president, and they got the Nobel Peace Prize, all for scaring us about global warming. So Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, became an absolute mainstay in American schools. How many times did you see it when you were going to school? Over and over and over again. And the global warming frenzy had truly reached its peak when all of that happened. Well, what happened with this man, Roger Revelle, who had started it all, the great scientist? Well, he had kind of lost interest in this population study center at Harvard and missed San Diego, I guess, and the beautiful Southern California climate. And he swallowed hard for his defeat there, and he came back to the University of California, San Diego as a professor. And there he wrote these letters, and I want you to look at them. The first one goes from his desk to U.S. Congressman Tim Wirth. Quote, "We should be careful not to arouse too much alarm about the rate and amount of warming before it comes clearer." And he wrote another letter here to Congressman Tim Bates. "Most scientists familiar with the subject are not yet willing to bet the climate this year is the result of greenhouse warming. As you very well know, climate is highly variable year to year. The causes of these variations are not at all well understood. My own personal belief is that we should wait another 10 to 20 years to really be convinced that the greenhouse is going to be important for human beings in both positive and negative ways." So there it was. The man who had started the global warming campaign had put up the flag of warning. Hey folks, this may not be for real. Caution, caution. Well, he even wrote an article that was published in a new science magazine called Cosmos. And he teamed with a professor, Fred Singer, to write that article. And that article was called "What to Do About Greenhouse Warming? Look Before You Leap." And the article concluded, and I quote, "The scientific basis for a greenhouse warming is too uncertain to justify drastic action at this time." Wow. The man who had started it? Well, how did Al Gore react to that? Well, he said, "I've made up my mind. Revelle is now senile. Pay no attention to that. The debate is over." And you've been hearing that now for 20 years. Al Gore won't debate anybody, and he claims it's for real. Well, we lost Roger Revelle. The fight had to go on without him. He passed away of a heart attack in 1991. And after he died, his family joined with the people at Scripps to make him the father of global warming. They rejected his denialism, and so did the UN IPCC. But Dr. Singer, he was made to be the scapegoat for it all. They said he had caused it. Well, I finally was able to interview Dr. Singer about this controversy.
He joins us live from Washington, D.C. Dr. Singer, what was Roger Revelle's view of carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas when you co-authored that Cosmos article back in 1990?
He was very relaxed about it. He basically looked at this as a grand geophysical experiment. After he and his collaborators like David Keeling found that CO2 was in fact increasing in the atmosphere, he and his colleagues were wondering if it would have any impact on climate. He wasn't about to make any judgment on the matter until the data were in. Of course, at that time, by 1990, we had about more than 10 years worth of satellite data, and the satellites didn't show any appreciable warming. And this is what actually set off my own thinking on the matter. I wondered what was going on. After all, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It's increasing. There's no question about that. Where is the warming? Well, it turns out that the atmosphere is much more complicated than the climate models believe, and the warming is offset probably by a kind of negative feedback that comes from clouds and water vapor in the atmosphere.
Did you and Revelle talk about Gore at all?
Actually, no, we never did, come to think of it. We only discussed the science. Revel's politics was very different from mine. He was, I think, a supporter of Gore. He was a liberal Democrat by inclination, and I think in every other way. But when it came to science, we completely agreed.
Interview that I had with Dr. Singer. Now, he's not the only scientist, please understand this, who questions this global warming frenzy, this climate change scare. In fact, there are 9,000 PhDs that have signed a petition denying that CO2 is causing global warming. There's 31,000 scientists in total who have signed that petition. There is a whole organization of them. A huge group from NASA recently wrote to the United Nations and to the U.S. Congress saying, please stop the global warming scare. There is a strong movement opposed to global warming. You don't hear about it in the media because, you know, the media has that Al Gore liberal bias, so it becomes very tough. And at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, Al Gore was a hero, and they proved it. They gave him the first Roger Revelle Award.
Honored tonight at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. He was given an award in recognition of his environmental work. KUSI's Tom Jordan is live in La Jolla with more on that. Tom?
Paul, Al Gore was the first ever recipient of the Roger Revelle Prize here at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, honored tonight for his work in environmental preservation. A rousing welcome for a man continuing his campaign on environmental awareness and protection. Former Vice President Al Gore being honored for his efforts with the first ever Roger Revelle Prize.
I want to express my very deep and genuine gratitude for this honor.
The award presented at this dinner marking the 100th birthday of the late Roger Revelle, who headed Scripps Institution of Oceanography from 1950 to 1964. Gore studied under Revelle at Harvard University in the 1960s and credits him for igniting his passion on the environment.
As a former student, still a student, trying to learn, but still inspired by a great teacher who was a great scientist and a great man.
Roger Revelle's work back in the 1960s was at the time considered revolutionary. Today, many scientists consider that work almost prophetic.
At that point, Mr. Gore pronounced Revelle senile and refused to debate global warming. He continues to refuse to debate. Many offers of thousands of dollars have been made for debate. He refuses. Today, Gore sequestered the media at this event, and he set forth rules: no questions, no interviews. I have learned that in 1991, Roger Revelle made what was his final speech at the high-powered, very private summer enclave of powerful men and politicians at the Bohemian Grove in Northern California. There he apologized for his research, for sending so many people in the wrong direction on global warming, and he worried about the political fallout from the UN IPCC and Al Gore. A man named Don Michael Schmedman, who lives in the San Francisco area, was there that day, and he remembers the Revelle speech very well. He has told me about it in some detail. So think of the irony. Today, Al Gore received the first Roger Revelle Award, honoring the man who sent him on his global warming campaign. But Revelle had realized that it was a false alarm and that the science was flawed before he died.